So I really appreciate this invitation, Brent and Christina. I'm always, I'll come back to Providence at any suggestion. It relates a little bit to my own personal heritage. I appreciate Brent not going through every detail of that bio that it always sounds like my mother wrote it. This was my first teaching job was in Providence years and years ago. I was a part-time teacher at RISD, so that gave me the taste for not just working in preservation, working in old cities with all their great complexities, but also got me off on the road to teaching. So I'm really grateful to come back. I'm also grateful that Providence is a place that is so dedicated and avid about preservation that people turn up before 9 o'clock on Saturday morning on a beautiful day to hear some pointy-headed academic from another city to show slides and to use 50-cent words. So I'll try to make it worth your while for your Saturday morning. I'll depart a little bit from what I originally talked to Christina about the topic of this, which came out of a short essay that I wrote for a book that a colleague put together about 50 ideas for the future of preservation, 50 things that the field needs to think about as a mode of self-examination as we think about how to be more relevant, how to be more useful, how to contribute more to the communities we live in today and in the future. That article was a lot about ownership in the kind of the narrow or sort of straightforward sense. Let me go this way. Of legalities, legal ownership. Probably the first thing that most of us think of. The slight pivot I wanted to make in this talk, and I'll try to organize it around just a few ideas, is to put multiple ideas of ownership on the table. Not just to try to be kind of clever and academic about it, to talk about aspects of cultural ownership, if such a thing is relevant. But to make the argument that as preservationists, we can't limit ourselves or narrow ourselves to talk about one kind of ownership or another. We have to challenge ourselves to talk about all the aspects of ownership, all the senses in which we think about built heritage as something that can be possessed, something that can be owned, something that can be connected to. Although we could easily sort of get into the weeds of kind of theory and history, it actually is a very practical endpoint or very practical sort of message at the end. And that is that the preservation field, and we're not alone in this, have to think very much more creatively about the kinds of institutions we create and the kind of institutions that we need in order to deal with both the legal aspects of ownership and the cultural aspects of ownership that connect to built heritage. And stories about the Cape Verdean community here, stories about some of the Philadelphia communities that we work with at Penn, absolutely connect to these really, frankly contentious issues about legal ownership and cultural ownership. So I won't have a paper that I read, but I have slides that are organized around seven distinct ideas about ownership. And I hope that the slides are going to be viewable from the back as well. There are, as usual, every time I teach a class, there are plenty of seats in the front. Nobody wants to be close to the lectern, although I understand in churches it's actually better to be closer to the front of the church. You more, closer connection with God, right? To be in the front of the pew. Anyway, so this first idea, the overarching idea, is to think about ownership in both the literal sense of legalities and the metaphorical sense of culture. In preservation, there are lots of different ways to understand the variety of different conceptions of ownership that we're already working with. But that we tend not to see their variety, we tend to see their simplicity. Historic house museums like Cliveden here in Germantown section of Philadelphia, classic preservation story of a house owned by a nonprofit organization, a local one, as well as the National Trust in this case. And it's a beautiful Georgian house of a rich family, and it's got beautiful furnishings inside. Even if you haven't been inside it, you can imagine what it's like to be inside it. It's a sort of classic of preservation. Just across the street is another house of similar era and quality called Uppsala. And very interestingly, this recently went through basically a devolution away from nonprofit ownership, which is a form of public ownership in a certain sense, to private ownership. The National Trust came into possession of this house and sold it with easements to a private owner. Also happens to be a Penn Design graduate student. And she and her husband bought the house, and with, of course, very clear easements about its conservation and protection, and some modicum of public accessibility. But here, a private ownership actually serves the preservation goals equally well, I would argue. And literally across the street, they used to be sort of cousin houses. On the side of cultural ownership, if you will, this is the contentious aspects of cultural ownership are very easy to see in lots of Philadelphia neighborhoods. Philadelphia, how many of you have been to Philadelphia any time in the last 10 years? All right, I'm preaching to the choir almost literally. So there are lots, Philadelphia is doing really well and growing very fast in certain neighborhoods. In other neighborhoods, it's doing dreadfully badly. There's a great difference between the very disadvantaged neighborhoods and the very thriving neighborhoods. Strawberry Mansion is one of those that is probably on the cusp of a lot of change. We're doing some work there right now that I'll talk about at the end of the talk. But one of the issues here is that the histories of the place, as it's been inhabited and re-inhabited over the last century by German immigrants, by Eastern European Jewish immigrants, by African American immigrants from the South, and by a now sort of mature and settled African American community, families who've been there for 3 generations, is now on the cusp of its cultural ownership is being challenged by, you guessed it, gentrification. The sort of the feared specter of improvement that has the effect of disenfranchising notions of cultural ownership, of taking people away metaphorically, estranging them metaphorically from their past, as well as in some cases literally, legally disenfranchising them from their homes, their real estate. Among the issues in Strawberry Mansion these days are these predatory developers who are trying to buy the houses of people in the most disadvantaged situations. Where at the same time, those people are searching for ways to hold on to those properties and to hold on to those social memories of their families who live around the corner, of their own past. They're rooted in the school down the street. All sorts of ways that they sort of support and connect themselves to their everyday worlds are very much tied up in built heritage. So as preservationists, it seems to me a very clear mission that we have, that we can be part of the solution to these issues of potential cultural disenfranchisement, of change of ownership, by reaching in to help people stay in their homes, to retain parts of the built environment that bear cultural meaning, and if not to freeze them in time, because we try not to do that, at least to make the pace of change in these neighborhoods sensible and supportable, both to the people who are there now and to the people who may be there in the future. So, second theme, we need to take a little bit of a deep dive. I'm going to try to move that little hand off of the, looks like a fly. Okay. To ask the question about what exactly drives preservation decisions, because there's sort of one version of why we do preservation that we talk about in conferences, and professors like me talk about in graduate school. And then there's the reality of how decisions are often made. So we talk a lot about culture as the driver of preservation decisions, but in the end of the day, political economy, matters of literal ownership, as well as how power is contended, especially in urban environments, have to be foregrounded. They have to be part of what preservationists see themselves as entering into. I often show this in the next slide when I talk to, whether it's classes or public audiences, about how preservationists see themselves. And so with your forgiveness in advance to those of you who identify as preservationists, This represents the sort of cultural impulse when we make decisions in preservation. We are curators, right? We love the beautiful specimens, and we identify those beautiful specimens. We kill them. We put them behind glass, and we put tags on their feet to tell other people what they mean, and we tell people don't touch. So we're taxidermists. Usually somebody shouts at me after I say that. Of course, we're not taxidermists, but this trend toward taxidermy, this desire to curate things, which a version of which is like taxidermy, is absolutely part of what we do. We are trying to, on behalf of the larger set of cultures, we're trying to choose those artifacts, those images, those stories that are meaningful now and will be meaningful in the future. So this curatorial role is really important, but we also have to be we have to realize the hazard of taking it too far and of being only curators. So the other image that resonates with a lot of preservationists is this picture of two kids slugging each other. I always point out that I'm sorry if you can't see this from the back, that the two kids, they're each landing a punch and they're both smiling. So this is taken by Stanley Kubrick in his career before he was a filmmaker. And it stands to, as I think, a marker of that preservationists are very much embrace the contention over what we do. That people are not going to agree with us. That we're pushing that stone up the hill and trying to protect aspects of culture from redevelopment, from destruction, from forgetting, from all these other forces in modern society. And as part of that, we have acquired this kind of pugilistic attitude. Again, this is an essential part of what we do because in a lot of ways, we do have to push back on some larger forces in society. But we, again, can't bear this too heavily and can't only find ourselves as as some people say, we're the preservationists are the people who say no. You may have, as a quick aside, Stephanie Meeks, the president of the National Trust, has been fond of saying recently that we need to be the movement of people who say yes. In fact, in the book that Christina and I first talked about, her article in that book is about the movement that says yes. So the next theme is about trying to find alignment or acknowledging the misalignment between these different senses of ownership, legal and literal ownership versus, as well as cultural and metaphorical ownership. And asking ourselves about whether the responsibilities that we embrace on both sides of that notion are that we're clear and honest about them, and that they connect with the institutions that we have to actually carry forward our work. And again, we tend to think in very canonical and a little bit too simplistic ways, I think, about the kinds of institutions we have at our disposal. We think about private sector developers. We think about nonprofit sector groups like Providence Preservation Society. I assume you're a nonprofit 501c3 NGO. And then we have the government, who also performs its role. So these long inherited roles of the public and the private and the nonprofit sector are very changeful these days. And some might see that as a threat. Others might see that, myself at least, I see that as an opportunity to create new kinds of organizations that are better aligned with the kinds of ownership challenges and responsibilities that we see for ourselves. The quick case study I wanted to give you about the difficulties that come with the misalignment of cultural ownership and literal ownership is a National Park Service site that we worked on several years ago in New Mexico called El Morro National Monument. How many of you have been to El Morro? Well, get thee to New Mexico next summer. It's an extraordinary place, about 2 hours from Albuquerque. Hopefully you can see this from the back, but it consists of a 2 square mile park, a very old one, but made in 1906. And it's this big cuesta, big sandstone mountain that sticks out of the high desert. And it's for thousands of years, it's been a place that's attracted people from different cultures because there's permanent source of water. In a very arid, it's about 7,500 feet altitude. It was known in the early 20th century as Inscription Rock because of the habit of people who went there for the water to stay and drink the water and hang out, and to carve into the sandstone next to the permanent pool their names, messages, sermons, other kinds of authoring other kinds of messages and texts. The National Park Service has greatly changed the landscape in the last 100 plus years that it's been the steward, in obvious ways by creating these little roadside pull-off interpretive. This is the landscape taxidermy. Right? You pull off your road and you read the sign and you know what the landscape means. And then there's this really actually beautiful modernist visitor center that is the other way that the National Park Service scripts an experience for visitors, and in many ways claims ownership of the place and its narratives. You go into the visitor center, you see the people, the Park Service, our Park Service colleagues in their militaristic uniforms, and some of them actually do wear guns, especially out in the West, of course. And so it's a government institution in all the best and more arch senses. The inscriptions themselves are a great case study of claiming ownership and contesting cultural ownership. The original, the first depictions, Western depictions of the inscriptions were these drawings by a couple of Philadelphia artists, the Kern brothers, who very carefully drew the Spanish inscriptions that the conquistadors made in the 16th century. If you look today, and I'm sorry, I'll give you these slides to look at later if you want to look at them more carefully. This is another one of the actual wall and the sandstone inscription. Here it's been, the modern conservation measure, in air quotes, was to take a very hard pencil and darken the inscriptions. Not a very good conservation measure. They don't do that anymore, believe me. But you might also notice this figure. It looks like a box with a line through it and a circle. That's a Puebloan petroglyph of a person. So very literally, the Spanish are writing on top of the Puebloan 1,000-year-old layer of cultural evidence. Literally erasing and rewriting as a way to claim ownership and to claim superiority. What you can't see as well is that there are lots of scrape marks and erasures, literal erasures of the sandstone, some of which are done by 19th and 20th century vandals and other travelers. Some of them done by the Park Service, who, when they made this a park, thought that the period of significance, which we're very fond of in preservation, didn't extend into the 19th and 20th century, so that any 19th or 20th century layer was literally scraped off with a wire brush. So it's kind of extreme preservation, taken a little bit too seriously. We of course wouldn't do any of these measures these days. Today we're doing exactly the opposite. We're trying to preserve all the many layers as they relate to each other, and these different layers of cultural imprint and cultural ownership, by understanding how the natural environment, both the stone monolith and the changeful vegetative and natural landscape environment, how they're affecting the inscriptions, because they are deteriorating, as you might guess. There's another set of narratives about this place, and believe me, this is the longest case study, and I will move on eventually. There's another set of narratives attached to the dwellings, the about 1,000-year-old dwellings at El Morro. There were enormous, between 400 and 600 room pueblo structures on top of the cuesta, up in the safe place up on top, and dozens, if not hundreds, of small little field houses that were maybe 2 or 3 rooms. There were little agricultural outbuildings that are now all lost and all just archaeological remains elsewhere in the park. But these are obviously the quite charismatic ruins from an anthropological and early preservation perspective. It looks like a building. It must be valuable. Let's protect it and curate it. So the curation of it included excavating it, which is, of course, if you excavate an adobe structure, it's pretty much the worst thing you can do for its conservation. We can see it's very legible how the building was organized. So this section of the pueblo that was excavated is the best place to interpret the incredible building technology and way of inhabiting this place that the Puebloans practiced. But every summer, the crews have to go out there and redo the mortar in the walls and to make sure that the structural failure is not advancing too much. The point I wanted to make about the adobe structures is that to the Park Service and to those of us, white Eastern academics or professionals, they are a representation of an ancient building technology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the things you read on that Park Service sign. To the Puebloans, who still live all over this part of the Southwest and have very thriving cultures, they mean something very different. And they are maybe a marker of a past time, but they're not the sort of singularly valuable artifact that needs to be curated very carefully. In other words, it's for the Puebloans, it's part of living heritage, and not something that is curated and subjected to taxidermy in various ways. The best lesson I had about that was taking a tour with one of the folks from Acoma Pueblo, one of the local Puebloan groups who works for the Park Service, or at that time worked for the Park Service. And when she walked me around the site, it was as if I'd never been there, even though I'd done tons of research on it. She showed me things I'd never seen, although I'd walked past them. That's my toe. And she told me stories that I never would have known or never would have imagined. So what do you think this is? It's a hole filled with water. And at first, my understanding of it is this was an indication of the geological structure and condition of the sandstone monolith. And so it's among those scientific features that we can map and document. It tells us about the composition and the condition of the stone. To her, this is like a baptismal font in a church to someone who's a worshipful Christian. This was put there by the deities in a particular place to frame a particular view and would be filled with water by the gods periodically so that her ancestors could have the water made available to them. So it's absolutely a practical feature of the landscape, but also a sacred feature of the landscape. And it's not as if this is something that is remote in time for her. This is something that she comes to and remembers her ancestors and practices her own kind of preservation, a kind of cultural ownership that falls almost completely outside of what the Park Service defines as cultural ownership. They don't interpret this. This is not protected in any way. It's just this kind of passive feature of the park that happens to exist in the Park Service management. To me, that along with the other kinds of features of the site, like these amazing hands this is some hundreds or maybe thousands of years old, a hand feature where the pigment is blown around it to give the shape of the human hand. These are really stark examples of how the institutional arrangements, whether it's simply the legalities or the management structures and the management plans for this very well-preserved site, don't acknowledge and don't align with these other extremely valuable senses of cultural ownership. And the question of how the Park Service, in this instance, pivots or innovates to bring those other ways of thinking into the management and into the preservation of the site. I think that's a really clear and empirical challenge that they have found some ways around, and if you have a question about that later, I can tell you about some of the ways in which they have actually tried to make the alignment closer in the case of El Morro. Okay, number 4. To pivot back to places like Providence and the cities that most of us live in, one of the realities of American culture and American history is that private property is not just an important legal concept, it's our civil religion, I would say. And it's in our sacred documents, the Constitution and the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, the 2 phrases, the 2 clauses at the end of that about due process, having to do not just with criminal cases, but also about property. And then the last clause, the takings clause, that requires the private property, if it's taken for public use, has to be justly compensated. These are 2 of the ways, and maybe the 2 most obvious ways, that a particular sense of ownership and particular canons of legal culture are really so firmly inscribed in American society that we don't see a way around them. And so the centrality of public property is, I think it's often very surprising to students who come to Penn from other countries. Where in many other countries it's assumed that the government, and especially the national government, has a fair amount of power to identify culturally important things and to own them legally and culturally. And it's just not the case in the US. There's the presumption here is that private ownership is preferred in almost every sense, apart from this sort of transgressive national park, that leftist idea of national parks. But the eminent domain and the sort of centrality of private property has to really be acknowledged as both a legal reality and also a cultural choice. And this is, I'm sorry, this is really too hard to see. That's Independence Hall. How many of you visited Independence Hall? Great, you're still awake. I ask questions periodically just to make sure everybody's still with me. This is the National Constitution Center, which sits 3 blocks away from Independence Hall across this great lawn, this great historic lawn that was created in the 1940s and 50s by urban renewal. And I think it's kind of, isn't it kind of curious that the National Constitution Center, where the Constitution is interpreted and celebrated, is on land that was taken by eminent domain. I think that's kind of a telling irony. Okay, move on to the next. So the fifth theme I wanted to talk about, and this gets more to the kind of transactional and everyday work of preservation, is the concept of market failure. Those of you who are economists or remember your Econ 001 course from college will remember that in a market system, that market failure is a recognition that not every good that's demanded by society is provided by markets. And we call those goods public goods. They are typically provided by the government or, in some cases, nonprofit organizations because because they're not provided through markets. We often talk in terms, economically talk in terms of stark, private goods and public goods. Private goods we can measure easily and we can trade easily and measure them easily because they are traded in markets. We can price them easily. Public goods are notable. One of their notable qualities is that they can't be priced because there are no markets. So things like clean air, public education, public education a couple generations ago, national defense, highways, things like this are the classic examples of public goods. We need them, but there's no market for them. Which is preservation? Which built heritage is on which side of the equation? Both, right? And really, almost any site or any built heritage project or parcel or place has qualities of both private and public goods, and we need to model the mixed good nature of historic preservation, built heritage, forcefully. Because if we don't acknowledge that built heritage is a mixed good, we won't have the right mix of institutions to provide and protect those goods. So we have to acknowledge both the private sector institutions like Zillow. How many of you are Zillow followers or fans? Yeah, it's okay, you can acknowledge it. Some people prefer Trulia, but So let's and Providence is a great place to recognize both the pros and the cons of the fact that there's a very robust market for built heritage, mostly for houses in the finer areas of cities. But this is a very important part of the preservation field. These days, very robustly acknowledged and taught in graduate programs. My colleague Donovan Ripcombe has been teaching an economics of preservation course for 15 or 20 years. It's a very important part of the practice these days. But it has a kind of a separate life from the more sort of culturally driven aspects of preservation. There are, even if we think about the private good aspects of built heritage, There are a number of different types of institutions that have been experimented with and are being experimented with more these days to address issues like gentrification and cultural displacement in the form of community land trusts. Are the community land trusts used in Rhode Island? Yeah. So it's a more common kind of institution for natural conservation, but it's been used increasingly in disadvantaged neighborhoods to create a vehicle, an institution for collective ownership of property. And not just collective ownership of property so that they can get a better price for it or they can just retain economic value, but it almost always has a very strong cultural component. So I see them as vehicles for cultural ownership as well as legal and economic ownership. And for those pair of reasons, I think they're a really interesting and robust kind of institution to continue to experiment with. On the side of public goods and cultural ownership, there's also a lot of variety in the ways that we think about cultural values. And it can be in that kind of, kind of strong-handed, dominant, and almost sort of pugilistic sense especially around issues of traumatic heritage. The starkest example I could think of was the World Trade Center Memorial in New York, where the competing notions of the cultural value among the different interest groups trying to shape the memorial at Ground Zero is a great lesson for the rest of the preservation field. And it's maybe most stark when it comes to very traumatic aspects of heritage. But even if we go back to El Moro, there are different cultural ways different ways of valuing that place culturally, and those are in competition with one another. It's not all sort of peaches and cream, and we can all get along together with our different narratives. Sometimes narratives, different cultural values are not commensurable and lead to conflict, just like the conflict that comes out of legal ownership. There's an incredible novel written essentially about the World Trade Center site by a woman named Amy Waldman. It's called The Submission. Some of you may have seen that a few years ago. It's the best way to explain how, for instance, the power of survivor families in the World Trade Center instance have this outsized, and some might say actually disproportionate amount of power over the cultural ownership of these sites. And so it's very stark in the 9/11 memorials, but that same dynamic is at play, and I would argue almost every heritage site. Amy Waldman was a journalist, but she actually felt like she needed to fictionalize this dynamic in order to tell it most starkly. I highly recommend the book. There are other aspects of cultural ownership that we also have to sort of take credit for and try to practice just as assiduously. That where different cultural values and different cultural uses and shared cultural ownership is easy and sustainable. Places like Prospect Park in Brooklyn, where I lived for a long time, there are many different things going on in this space. There are many people who feel like they have ownership of it culturally. There is actually shared legal ownership in a sense that the city and an NGO called the Prospect Park Alliance and other NGOs have responsibility for different physical parts of the site. And given the range of resources, the space, the different functions, I'm not trying to say that they never come into conflict, but there's a set of institutional arrangements and alignments that make the diversity of cultural ownerships and the diversity of legal ownerships work really well together. So there are ways in which we think places that we're practicing these good habits already. The idea of the sixth of the seven themes, the commons, comes right out of acknowledging that the private good nature of built heritage is a force that we need to reckon with constantly. Some of you may have read in the past or certainly heard discussed an essay that is now quite old called The Tragedy of the Commons. written by an ecologist named Garrett Hardin in the 60s, in which he used the metaphor of cows grazing on a commons to demonstrate that left to our own devices, I didn't take this. Left to our own devices, we will, as economic beings, we will each try to maximize our own utility by putting the maximum amount of cows in the pasture so that we benefit. If we all do that, there'll be more cows than sky in this picture, and the commons, the pasture, will be consumed, will be ruined. And so it was interesting coming from an ecologist. This is essentially a sort of a political and moral argument that there's no technical solution to how to manage these commonly held, commonly shared resources. There has to be a political solution. His political solution was government action, and it wasn't just about cows and pasture. He was also talking about population control, which I won't go into. But his argument was, and the phrase that he used always, I remember very easily, it's mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. So government regulation was our only solution to this commonly owned resource. That has been around for a long time, and I still ask my students to read it and discuss it as a way of understanding some of the basic political economy drivers behind preservation and planning and sustainability. Decades later, a political scientist / economist named Elinor Ostrom, after a lifetime of work, elaborated a set of explanations and advice that while acknowledging the basic problem of the commons, that if we left to our own individual devices, we will consume it. Her recommendation was that the state and the market are not the only options. And she very clearly tried to inspire people to not just to create new kinds of institutions to manage what she called common pool resources. She was a social scientist, so she had to think of a fancier name for the commons than the commons. So to manage common pool resources, she looked to culture, and she looked to traditional culture for modes of organizing, for instance, water resources among traditional farmers in India, and farmland as a resource in other parts of Asia. So she actually looked backward, almost as an historian, for modes of cultural ownership that would solve the legal ownership problems. So it's another way in which these different senses of ownership are really intimately linked. And in this case, this is not just some pointy-headed person, scribbling books that no one will ever read. She won the Nobel Prize for this in 2009. I still think the only woman to win the Nobel Prize for economics. She's got some great speeches online on YouTube, so you can go watch her in your spare time. She unfortunately passed away just a couple of years ago. Okay, the last of the themes, and I'll wrap up with this, is an idea that really only occurred to me after I got through the first 6 themes, and it's that this idea of ownership, we don't actually think of that as something that we can possess and celebrate as heritage. We think of it as like a condition of the heritage that we identify. But what if we thought about the ownership of places more literally as part of the heritage that we're trying to protect and preserve? To me, it falls into this category of intangible heritage or living heritage that various kinds of scholars and practitioners have been putting on the table in the last generation or so, that we can't just think in terms of buildings and these fixed and mostly unchangeable assets or objects as our responsibility as preservationists. We also have to think about the ideas attached to these objects and to acknowledge more strongly that those are the things that we really want to preserve. Buildings are often the means to the end of preserving a cultural trait or a cultural habit, and buildings are not often the end themselves. So if we acknowledge that, and cultural landscape theory is one of the ways that the field is organizing its thinking to do this, to preserve the function of places, or the functions, plural, of built heritage, and not just their form. The easiest example of that is Main Street, or the Main Street program of the National Trust. Everybody, certainly in the U.S., this is such a sort of an embedded cultural trait and a heritage place. The Main Street program, when it was created in the 1970s, was really radical. And the reason it was radical in my mind is that it was not about preserving buildings. And indeed, if you look at some of these buildings, people, especially in the 1970s, would immediately want to tear that off, right? That's not significant. That's not in the period of significance. We're going to rip that metal front off that 19th century masonry building. So it wasn't about preserving the buildings as an end in themselves. Main Street program is about preserving the commercial vitality, the economic function of Main Street, and protecting it against the threat of malls and suburbanization and highway development. So the program, as it's been successful, very successful for the last 40 years, has been basically a cultural landscape preservation policy about preserving the function and I would say also the ownership, the collective ownership of Main Street businesses and buildings as a means to this larger end of preserving Main Street as the center of communities, right? And it's a center of the community and a heritage place in the sense of private goods. People, individual owners own most of these buildings. People go to buy and sell things in these shops, and that is part of its heritage. There's also public good qualities. You know, the sidewalks, the gathering space, the idea of Main Street as the kind of communal gathering space and symbol of a thriving small town. And therefore, it sort of meets this very robustly, this idea that built heritage is a mixed good with both private and public aspects. So I'll end with this last slide about a community that we're working in right now in Philadelphia called Strawberry Mansion that I mentioned very early on, where we are working with a group of students and I are working with local residents and local community development corporation to try to identify preservation strategies that can both preserve and improve the built environment, the built fabric, these very typical Philadelphia very typical two-story row houses on these very, very small streets, as well as the charismatic civic buildings like this school, which is closed. Philadelphia closed 40 or 50 schools in the last few years. How do we point preservation measures at protecting this built heritage while also protecting the cultural ownership of this building by the people who've been living there the last 3 generations or so? The mostly African-American community who inherited a Jewish neighborhood and made it their own while honoring the previous layers and are now being threatened by encroaching development from 2 of the 3 directions. And this is just a quick map. This is Strawberry Mansion neighborhood, basically that triangle. And it's Fairmount Park on this side. It's a big rail corridor on this side. And just a sort of an arbitrary line identifying this neighborhood as part of North Philly on the north side. So Temple University is over here. It's a neighborhood called Brewery Town down here. Gentrifying. The park is going to remain the park happily. But here's some of the maps that we're creating these days. This is a map of vacancy. So both the government programs, effectively urban renewal, sort of like ham-handed urban renewal, that they didn't quite do it even as well as they thought they were trying to do it, has resulted in lots of vacancy. Not just super blocks, and some of these are actually schoolyards, but you can see all the missing pieces of fabric in small single lots, but also in bigger lots. And public ownership. This is a map of public ownership. So lots of redevelopment opportunities. And the question for us as preservationists is how to protect and strengthen the built environment. But in thinking about developing and improving the built heritage, how do we guarantee that the cultural ownership will be not just frozen in time, but preserved for the people who are already there and not just made available to the next people who arrive. So these are the kinds of issues that I think, thinking in much broader terms about ownership and how we organize to deal with it are really central issues to dealing with the community level and urban level challenges in preservation. So I'll end there and happy to answer any questions.